They didn't listen carefully because what I'm about to say may sound quiet, but it will shake something deep inside you. There comes a moment when the empath stops explaining, stops hoping, stops bleeding in silence, not because they stopped caring, but because their soul finally chose peace. And when that moment happens, when the empath walks away, something irreversible begins in the avoidant, not on the outside, but inside. An empath does not leave suddenly. They leave slowly. After countless chances, after prayers whispered at night, after forgiving things they never should have had to survive, they stay longer than logic allows, longer than dignity advises, longer than the heart can safely endure. So when they finally turn away, understand this: what left was not weakness. What left was strength that had been drained dry. The avoidant often believes distance gives them power. Silence feels like control. Emotional withdrawal feels like safety. But that illusion only works as long as someone stays to absorb the consequences. The empath did that. They softened the blows. They translated emotions. They held space for pain that was never theirs to carry. And when that support disappears, the avoidant is left alone with themselves. That is where the psychological storm begins. Because now there is no one reminding them they matter. No one chasing. No one explaining. No one emotionally regulating the chaos they refuse to face. The quiet becomes unbearable. The freedom they wanted feels empty. And the control they thought they had dissolves into anxiety, regret, and restlessness. This is not punishment. This is exposure. The empath walking away does not create pain, it reveals it. Suddenly, memories resurface. Moments they dismissed replay in silence. The warmth they took for granted now feels like a language they can no longer speak. And the avoidant begins to realize something terrifying. The one who truly saw them is gone. An empath's absence is not loud. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain. It simply removes light. And darkness, when left alone, must face itself. Here is the divine truth: when someone continuously avoids love, truth will eventually confront them through loss. Not to destroy them, but to awaken them. Growth often arrives dressed as discomfort, and accountability often feels like suffering before it feels like freedom. For the empath, walking away is not failure. It is alignment. It is the soul choosing divine order over emotional chaos. It is understanding that love without safety is not love, it is self-abandonment. And when the empath leaves, healing begins on both sides, but in very different ways. The empath rises. Their nervous system calms. Their intuition clears. Their joy slowly returns. Peace meets them where pain once lived. The avoidant, however, must sit with themselves, with their patterns, with their fears of intimacy, with the truth they ran from, and that inner confrontation that is the psychological hell. Not because someone left, but because someone finally stopped saving them from themselves. So if you are the empath, hear this clearly. Walking away was not cruelty. It was obedience to your soul. And if you are the avoidant, understand this moment is not the end, it is an invitation. An invitation to heal what you avoided, to face what you denied, to grow where you once hid. Because love does not disappear to punish. It leaves so truth can finally speak. An empath never walks away on impulse. That choice is not born in a moment of anger, pride, or emotional drama. It is born in exhaustion so deep that the soul begins to feel heavy. An empath leaves only after staying far longer than was healthy, far longer than was fair to themselves. They leave after explaining their feelings in every language they know: soft words, patience, tears, silence, understanding. They leave after hoping that love would eventually be enough to awaken change. An empath is wired to endure. They sense pain before it is spoken. They notice emotional shifts others ignore. They feel responsible not only for their own emotions, but for the emotional atmosphere of the entire connection. Because of this, they rationalize behaviors that should have been boundaries. They excuse distance as fear. They interpret avoidance as trauma. They tell themselves, if I love harder, stay calmer, give more space, it will get better. And so they stay. What most people don't see is how much the empath loses in that staying. Their energy drains quietly. Their nervous system remains in survival mode. They become hyperaware, constantly scanning for emotional shifts, preparing themselves for withdrawal or rejection. Over time, their intuition begins warning them, but they override it in the name of love, loyalty, and hope. The empath doe. She's not leaving at the first disappointment. They leave after 1,000 small wounds, after promises repeated but never fulfilled, after emotional needs minimized, postponed, or ignored, after feeling unseen while giving their entire presence. Each time they forgive, something inside them thins. Each time they compromise their truth, they move a little farther from themselves. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where staying hurts more than leaving. And that moment is not dramatic. It is quiet. It feels like clarity rather than emotion. The heart stops pleading. The mind stops negotiating. The soul simply says, I can't do this anymore. That is when the decision is made not to abandon the other person, but to stop abandoning the self. This is why, when an empath walks away, there is no turning back. By the time they leave, they have already grieved the relationship while still inside it. They have mourned the potential, the dreams, the version of love they hoped would exist. The departure may look sudden to others, but internally it has been building for a long time. Exhaustion changes perspective. It removes illusion. It strips away denial. The empath finally sees that love without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. They realize that compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. And in that realization, something sacred activates self-respect. Walking away is not about anger. It is about preservation. It is the final act of love the empath gives themselves after giving too much to everyone else. They leave not because they stopped caring, but because caring was costing them their peace, their health, their identity. And once that threshold is crossed, the empath does not argue, chase, or explain anymore. Their silence is not manipulation. It is recovery. Their absence is not revenge. It is rest. Avoidant behavior is often misunderstood as strength, independence, or emotional self-control. On the surface, it can look calm, detached, even confident. But beneath that exterior is not power, it is protection. Avoidance is a strategy built on fear, not freedom. It develops as a way to survive emotional environments where closeness once felt unsafe, overwhelming, or unpredictable. Instead of learning how to process emotion, the avoidant learns how to distance from it. Control is central to this pattern. By limiting emotional access, the avoidant believes that BY can prevent disappointment, rejection, or vulnerability. They decide how close someone is allowed to get, how much intimacy is acceptable, and when connection must be withdrawn. Distance becomes a shield. Silence becomes a weapon, even if unconsciously used. Emotional withdrawal offers them the illusion of safety because if they don't feel deeply, they can't be hurt deeply. Avoidants often equate emotional dependence with weakness. Needing someone feels dangerous, even humiliating. So they create narratives that justify disconnection. I just need space. I'm not good with emotions. This is too much. Or I work better alone. These statements are not lies, they are defenses. They protect the avoidant from confronting the deeper truth that intimacy triggers unresolved fear. What reinforces this behavior is that avoidance often works temporarily. Pulling away reduces anxiety in the moment. It restores a sense of control. The nervous system calms, not because the issue is resolved, but because the stimulus emotional closeness has been removed. Over time, this teaches the avoidant that distance equals relief, and so the pattern repeats. However, this relief comes at a cost. Avoidance does not eliminate feelings, it delays them. Unexpressed emotions do not disappear, they accumulate. They settle into the body as tension, irritability, restlessness, or numbness. The avoidant may struggle to articulate what they feel, not because they feel nothing, but because they have trained themselves not to look too closely. In relationships, this creates a painful imbalance. The avoidant unconsciously relies on the other person to carry emotional weight. The partner becomes the initiator, the emotional translator, the one who maintains connection. Meanwhile, the avoidant maintains control by staying just out of reach. They may offer moments of closeness, then retreat once vulnerability increases. This push-pull dynamic keeps the avoidant in power while keeping intimacy limited. The tragedy is that avoidance is not the absence of desire for connection, it is fear of it. Many avoidants deeply want love, but only on terms that feel emotionally manageable. They crave closeness without exposure, intimacy without risk, connection without surrender. And those conditions are impossible to sustain. Distance may feel like control, but it is actually confinement. By avoiding emotional engagement, the avoidant avoids growth. They protect themselves from pain, but also from depth, healing, and authentic love. Emotional withdrawal narrows life. It limits relationships to what feels safe rather than what feels true. Control through avoidance is fragile. It depends on others staying engaged despite the distance. It works only as long as someone else is willing to bridge the emotional gap. When that person stops reaching, the avoidant is left with the very thing they feared most, not intimacy, but isolation. The empath often becomes the emotional stabilizer in a relationship without ever consciously choosing that role. Their presence regulates tension, smooths conflict, and absorbs emotional shock. They listen when words are hard to find. They sense moods before they are spoken. They instinctively adjust themselves to keep the emotional environment from collapsing. Over time, the relationship quietly organizes itself around the empath's capacity to feel, understand, and hold space. For the avoidant, this becomes an unspoken dependence. Even while resisting closeness, they rely on the empath to manage emotional weight they themselves cannot tolerate. The empath becomes the interpreter of feelings, the one who names what is happening, the one who brings calm after withdrawal. Their consistency creates stability, even when the avoidant is distant or unpredictable. And because the support is given freely, it is rarely recognized as essential. When the empath walks away, the first thing that disappears is not love, it is regulation. The emotional buffer is gone. There is no one softening edges or filling silences with understanding. The avoidant suddenly faces emotional spikes without the familiar grounding presence. Anxiety increases, irritation surfaces, confusion sets in. What once felt manageable now feels overwhelming. This loss is deeply disorienting because the avoidant may not consciously realize what they depended on. They may tell themselves they never needed anyone, that independence is their strength, yet their nervous system tells a different story. The calm they associated with distance begins to unravel. Sleep becomes restless. Thoughts loop. The mind searches for relief it once accessed indirectly through the empath's presence. The empath had been doing invisible labor regulating emotions, offering reassurance through tone, patience, and availability. They were the emotional home base. Without that anchor, the avoidant must now confront feelings they outsourced for years. This is not immediate insight, it is discomfort first. The body reacts before the mind understands. Emotional dysregulation shows up in subtle ways. The avoidant may feel an urge to reconnect but resist it. They may feel irritated by memories yet unable to stop replaying them. They may seek distractions, work, noise, movement, anything to avoid sitting with the internal chaos. What they are experiencing is not longing alone, it is the shock of emotional self-reliance. The empath's absence forces a reckoning. Without someone absorbing emotional intensity, the avoidant must either suppress feelings further or finally feel them. Suppression grows harder. The familiar strategy of withdrawal no longer works because there is no one to withdraw from. Silence stops being soothing and starts being loud. This is where psychological pressure builds. The avoidant begins to recognize how much emotional stability came from the relationship, not from their own inner resources. Regret may surface not always as sadness, but as restlessness or an didn't generic. The loss of the empath exposes emotional underdevelopment that was hidden by the relationship structure. The empath did not just offer love, they offered regulation, safety, and emotional continuity. When they leave, the avoidant is left to face an internal landscape they never learned to navigate. This is not punishment, it is reality asserting itself. Growth can no longer be postponed because the external support system is gone. The empath's departure removes the emotional training wheels. What remains is the raw experience of self, unfiltered, unmanaged, and unavoidable. Silence changes meaning when the empath walks away. Before, silence was a familiar rhythm often initiated by the avoidant, used as a way to regain control, regulate overwhelm, or create distance without confrontation. Silence once felt safe, even empowering. It was a pause that assumed someone would still be there when it ended. But when the empath leaves, silence no longer functions the same way. It transforms. In the presence of an empath, silence is softened. It is buffered by reassurance, patience, and understanding. Even when words stop, emotional connection remains alive through consistency, presence, and availability. The empath intuitively holds the space, trusting that connection will resume. This makes silence tolerable, even comfortable for the avoidant. But once the empath is gone, silence loses its safety net. There is no one holding emotional continuity, no one waiting quietly, no one interpreting distance as temporary. What was once a controlled pause becomes an empty void. And emptiness is far louder than noise. The avoidant begins to feel the weight of unanswered space. There is no message coming, no emotional signal to reassure them that connection still exists. The silence no longer resets the system, it destabilizes it. The mind fills the quiet with assumptions, questions, and self-doubt. Thoughts that were once avoided now echo. Silence forces awareness. It removes distraction. Without the empath's steady presence, there is nothing to counter the internal narrative. The avoidant may replay conversations, re-experience moments of withdrawal, or recognize patterns they previously dismissed. The absence of response creates an internal dialogue that grows increasingly uncomfortable. What makes this silence especially loud is finality. The empath's silence is different. From emotional withdrawal, it is resolved. It does not provoke. It does not test. It does not wait for pursuit. It simply exists as a boundary. And boundaries, when encountered by someone who relied on distance, feel confronting. The avoidant may initially interpret the silence as temporary. They may assume time will restore balance. But as days stretch on, the realization begins to form. This silence is not a tactic. It is an ending. And that recognition shifts everything. Without emotional feedback, the avoidant loses orientation. They no longer know how they are perceived. The familiar dynamic of push and pull is gone. There is no one reacting to their distance, no one chasing clarity, no one bridging the emotional gap. This absence removes the role they unconsciously relied on. The nervous system reacts. Restlessness replaces calm. The quiet feels intrusive. What once felt like relief now feels like pressure. Silence exposes unmet needs the avoidant never learned to articulate. It brings to the surface the fear of being truly alone, not just physically, but emotionally unseen. The empath's silence is powerful because it is not cold, it is complete. It does not demand understood back. They didn't ding. It does not explain itself. It reflects self-respect. And in that reflection, the avoidant is forced to confront the impact of their own emotional distance. Silence becomes a mirror. It reflects what was taken for granted. It amplifies what was avoided, and it teaches a truth the avoidant can no longer escape. Distance only works when someone stays close enough to feel it. When the empath leaves, something deeper is triggered in the avoidant than simple loneliness. It is not just the absence of a person, it is the awakening of unprocessed emotional history. Beneath the surface of avoidant behavior lies a foundation built in early experiences where emotional needs were either inconsistently met, misunderstood, or emotionally unsafe to express. These experiences do not disappear with age, they are stored in the nervous system, waiting for similar emotional conditions to reactivate them. The empath, often through their patience, emotional attunement, and consistency, unknowingly becomes a key that unlocks those dormant wounds. They offer what the avoidant's inner world has long struggled to trust: emotional safety. Even if the avoidant resists it consciously, the nervous system begins to relax in the presence of genuine care. But that relaxation is fragile because it is built on unfamiliar territory, intimacy without control. When the empath walks away, that emotional safety disappears, and what remains is not just loss but activation. The nervous system does not register this relationship ended as a neutral fact. It often registers it as abandonment, rejection, or emotional danger. This reaction is not always logical. It is deeply somatic. The body remembers what the mind may not fully understand. This is where childhood imprints begin to surface. The avoidant may start experiencing emotional states that feel disproportionate to the situation's sudden anxiety, irritability, emptiness, or a vague sense of panic that is hard to name. These feelings are not new, they are old emotions reactivated by present loss. The empath's departure becomes a mirror that reflects earlier experiences of emotional disconnection. Memories may return in fragments rather than full narratives. Not always clear scenes, but sensations being unheard, emotionally dismissed, left to soothe too early, or feeling that vulnerability was unsafe. The empath's presence had temporarily softened these patterns by providing consistent emotional responsiveness. Their absence removes that buffer, exposing the underlying emotional architecture. The avoidant may not consciously link these reactions to childhood experiences. Instead, they may interpret them as confusion about the relationship itself. They might ask, "Why does this hurt more than it should?" or "Why can't I move on?" without realizing that what is being felt is not only present loss, but historical echo. The intensity is not about the empath alone, it is about what the empath temporarily soothed. The psychological hell begins when these internal layers collide with conscious denial. The avoidant often maintains a self-concept of independence, emotional self-sufficiency, or detachment. But the resurfacing of old emotional wounds challenges that identity. It creates internal conflict. One part insists they are fine alone, while another part is reacting as if something essential has been taken away. This inner contradiction creates emotional noise. The nervous system oscillates between numbness and activation. At times, the avoidant may feel detached and rational. At other times, overwhelmed and unsettled. This inconsistency is disorienting because it undermines their usual coping strategy: distance from feeling. The empath's absence does not create the wound, it reveals it. It exposes the emotional gaps that were never fully healed, only managed. And when those gaps are exposed, the avoidant is forced into a confrontation with themselves that cannot be externalized or controlled. What makes this experience so intense is that it is internal. There is no one to argue with, no situation to fix, no external resolution to create distance from the feeling. The empath's departure removes the external relationship, leaving only the internal one, the relationship the avoidant has with their own unprocessed emotional world. Walking away for an empath is often misunderstood as an emotional reaction, but in reality it is an act of deep self-alignment. It is not the collapse of love, it is the recognition that love alone is not enough when it consistently demands self-abandonment. By the time an empath chooses to leave, they have usually tried everything within their emotional capacity to make the connection work. Understanding, patience, communication, forgiveness, and emotional labor that of bad and goes unseen and unreciprocated. What makes this departure significant is that it rarely comes from a place of anger. Anger may appear on the surface, but beneath it is exhaustion, emotional, mental, and energetic depletion that accumulates over time. The empath does not leave because a single moment breaks them. They leave because they finally understand the pattern that the moment represents. It is the realization that their presence is being used as a place where unresolved emotional avoidance is repeatedly deposited, without true accountability or change. Self-respect begins to rise when the empath recognizes this imbalance. They start to see that continuously staying in a dynamic where their emotional needs are minimized requires them to abandon themselves repeatedly. Every time they silence their intuition, justify harmful behavior, or override their emotional truth to preserve connection, they move further away from their own center. And over time, that internal disconnection becomes more painful than the relationship itself. Walking away becomes the point where inner truth overrides external attachment. It is the moment where the empath stops negotiating with hope and starts honoring reality. This is not a rejection of love, but a redefinition of it. Love in its healthy form cannot require self-erasure. It cannot thrive where one person is constantly stretching, adapting, and absorbing while the other remains emotionally unavailable. The decision to leave often comes with grief already in motion. The empath has usually mourned the relationship long before it physically ends. They grieve the version of the person they believed could meet them halfway. They grieve the potential that was consistently postponed. They grieve the emotional reciprocity they kept waiting for. So when they finally walk away, it is not the beginning of loss, it is the completion of it. This is why the departure often appears calm on the outside. There is no need for dramatic closure because the empath has already processed much of it internally. The silence that follows is not confusion, it is clarity. It is the result of a long internal negotiation finally reaching its conclusion. Self-respect in this context is not loud or confrontational. It is quiet but firm. It is the decision to no longer participate in dynamics that require self-betrayal to maintain connection. The understanding that love without emotional safety becomes a slow erosion of identity. And the empath reaches a point where preserving identity becomes more important than preserving attachment. What many do not see is that the empath does not leave to punish the other person. They leave because they can no longer justify staying in a situation where their emotional reality is continuously invalidated or unmet. There is no desire to destroy, only a need to stop disappearing within the relationship. In that sense, walking away is not abandonment, it is restoration. It is the return to emotional integrity after prolonged internal fragmentation. It is the moment the empath chooses to become whole again instead of staying where they are only partially alive. The avoidance psychological hell is not created by the empath's departure alone. It is activated by the confrontation with their own internal world once external distractions are removed. At first glance, it may appear like simple regret or sadness, but what unfolds is far more complex. It is a layered emotional experience involving regret, cognitive dissonance, suppressed grief, and identity disruption. When the empath is pre-bent, much of the avoidance emotional discomfort remains regulated or avoided through distance, distraction, or subtle reliance on the partner's emotional stability. The relationship dynamic allows them to function without fully engaging with their deeper emotional needs. But once the empath is gone, that external regulation disappears. What remains is the self-unfiltered, unbuffered, and unavoidable. Regret is often the first conscious emotion to surface, but it is not always clean or direct. It may appear as intrusive thoughts, memory loops, or sudden emotional flashes tied to past interactions. The avoidant begins to replay moments that were previously dismissed or rationalized. Conversations take on new meaning in hindsight. Small gestures from the empath that once seemed ordinary now carry emotional weight. What was once taken for granted becomes painfully significant in absence. But beneath regret lies something deeper. Cognitive dissonance. The avoidant often holds two conflicting internal beliefs at the same time. One part of them believes they value independence and emotional distance. The other part is now experiencing the pain of losing a meaningful emotional bond. The two realities clash, creating internal tension. The mind attempts to resolve this by either minimizing the loss or idealizing the past, but neither brings lasting relief. As this tension continues, suppressed grief begins to surface. Unlike expressive grief, this type is often internalized. It does not always manifest as visible sadness. Instead, it may show up as restlessness, irritability, numbness, or a sense of emptiness that is difficult to name. The avoidant may struggle to articulate what exactly feels wrong, because the emotion is not tied to a single moment. It is the accumulation of what was never fully felt during the relationship. The psychological discomfort intensifies because there is no clear outlet for resolution. The empath is no longer present to engage, respond, or regulate emotional exchanges. There is no conversation to reframe, no argument to resolve, no immediate pathway back to emotional equilibrium. The absence of interaction removes the structure that previously contained emotional unpredictability. This is where identity disruption begins to emerge. The avoidant sense of self is often partially constructed around emotional autonomy and controlled dist. Losing the empath destabilizes that structure. The relationship may have been one of the few spaces where emotional engagement existed, even if inconsistently. Without it, the avoidant is left alone with internal material they were not prepared to process. The hell is not external punishment, it is internal confrontation. It is the realization that emotional avoidance does not eliminate emotional need. It only delays it, and when the delay ends, the accumulation becomes unavoidable. There is also a painful awareness that the empath's presence was not just emotional support, but emotional translation. They helped make sense of feelings that the avoidant could not easily access or express. Without that presence, emotional clarity becomes fragmented. The avoidant may feel as though something essential has been lost but struggle to fully define what it is. This creates a cycle of internal searching without resolution. The mind revisits the past, looking for answers, closure, or relief, but the emotional system remains unsettled. The lack of external resolution forces internal reflection, and that reflection is uncomfortable because it cannot be controlled or escaped in the same way avoidance once functioned. Ultimately, the psychological hell is the confrontation with emotional reality that can no longer be bypassed. It is not the loss of the empath alone, it is the loss of the structure that allowed emotional avoidance to feel sustainable. What ultimately underlies the entire dynamic between an empath and an avoidant is not just psychology, but a deeper principle of balance and unseen order that restores equilibrium when emotional truth is consistently denied. In every relationship where one person overgives and the other withdraws, life itself begins to correct the imbalance, not through punishment but through consequence, not through revenge but through revelation. When emotional energy is repeatedly taken without being matched, something eventually breaks, not in anger, but in clarity. The empath reaches a threshold where continued sacrifice no longer feels like love, but like self-erasure. That moment is not random, it is the culmination of accumulated emotional awareness. It is the point where the soul recognizes that growth is being blocked by staying. Divine principles in this sense are not about external force intervening dramatically. They are about internal truth becoming impossible to ignore. The empath begins to feel a quiet but undeniable shift. What once felt tolerable now feels misaligned. What once felt like hope now feels like repetition. And what once felt like love now feels like depletion. This shift is not emotional chaos, it is spiritual clarity. When the empath walks away, it is not the end of connection alone, it is the restoration of alignment. They are no longer participating in a dynamic that requires them to constantly override their intuition. In leaving, they return to themselves. Their nervous system begins to settle, not because life becomes perfect, but because self-betrayal stops. Peace begins where internal contradiction ends. On the other side, the avoidant is confronted with the absence of what was quietly stabilizing their emotional world. Without the empath's presence, emotional avoidance no longer has a counterpart to balance it. What remains is exposure. The absence is not empty, it is revealing. It reflects patterns that were previously hidden behind relational dynamics. This is where life's corrective nature becomes visible, not in sudden punishment, but in the gradual removal of emotion, buffering. The avoidant is no longer able to outsource emotional regulation. They are left with their internal world exactly as it is, without distortion or support. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. It is the beginning of awareness. From a deeper perspective, nothing is being taken away unfairly. What is being removed is what was not sustainable. A relationship built on imbalance cannot remain stable indefinitely. Either it evolves into reciprocity or it dissolves into distance. The empath leaving is not destruction, it is truth reaching its limit.